The kitchen smells like garlic and butter. A chef in Cape Town lays out a cutting board. Kudu, ostrich, springbok, even crocodile tail. All legal, all on the menu tonight. He reaches for the next tray. It's empty. A waiter shakes his head before the question is even asked. Not that one. It's a strange moment, if you stop to notice it. This is a country where almost every wild animal eventually ends up on a plate. Lion has been eaten. Elephant has been eaten in famine and in feast for centuries. Even hippo, one of the most dangerous animals on the continent, shows up in traditional cookery. But rhino? Never. Not in restaurants, not in markets, not in the diets of the very communities who have hunted alongside these animals for 1,000 generations. What if the reason isn't about taste at all? What if the world's most trafficked, most desperately poached large mammal is killed constantly and eaten almost never? And what if the real question was never, why don't we eat rhino, but something far stranger? Why do we kill an animal at industrial scale for a single body part, while its meat, tons of it, is simply left to rot? Here's where the mystery begins. Start with the numbers, because they don't make sense on the surface. Since 2007, more than 10,000 rhinos have been killed by poachers across Africa, according to data compiled by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Each one weighs, on average, over 1,000 kilograms. That's millions of kilograms of red meat, protein-rich, biologically no different from any other large grazing mammal. And almost none of it is consumed. Poachers take the horn, sometimes only the horn. The carcass, that entire mountain of meat, is abandoned in the bush to vultures and flies. If this were about hunger, about survival, about feeding hungry communities, this would be the most inefficient crime in human history. So, what is it about? Follow the horn, and the story gets stranger still. Rhino horn is not ivory. It's not bone. It is made almost entirely of keratin, the exact same protein that makes up your fingernails and the outer layer of your hair. In 1983, researchers at the Royal Chemical Society in London confirmed what biochemists had suspected for decades. Chemically, rhino horn is nearly indistinguishable from a clump of compressed hair. You could, in theory, get the same primary compound by biting your nails for a decade. Researchers have tested this claim directly. In 1990, a study commissioned by conservation groups and reviewed by pharmacologists at the University of Hong Kong dosed lab conditions with rhino horn extract, searching for any measurable effect on fever, inflammation, or pain. The results were unremarkable. Mild, inconsistent, statistically indistinguishable in most trials from the effect of any other compressed keratin. No aphrodisiac property. No cancer-fighting compound. Nothing that would justify a price tag rivaling cocaine by weight. And yet, in parts of Vietnam and China, powdered rhino horn has sold for more than the price of gold, marketed as a cure for everything from cancer to hangovers, a belief with no support in modern pharmacology. But here's where it gets strange. If the horn holds no unique medicinal power and the meat is thrown away, what exactly are people paying tens of thousands of dollars for? Not a cure, not a nutrient, a symbol. To understand why, you have to go back further than the poaching crisis, back to a much older, much quieter kind of taboo. Anthropologists studying food restrictions across cultures have long noted a pattern. The animals humans refuse to eat are rarely chosen at random. They're usually the animals closest to us in status, companions, symbols of royalty, or creatures considered too powerful, too rare, or too sacred to reduce to food. In much of southern and eastern Africa, the rhino has occupied exactly that space for centuries. Zulu and Shona oral traditions describe the rhino not as prey, but as a kind of living monument. Dangerous, ancient, almost geological in presence. Killing one for meat in many of these traditions wasn't just impractical. It was close to unthinkable, the same way you wouldn't butcher a monument for firewood. Compare that to the elephant, an animal just as large, just as dangerous, and yet documented as a food source across multiple African famine periods, including recorded accounts from colonial-era East Africa in the early 1900s. Same size, same danger, wildly different fate on the plate. Why would two of the continent's largest animals diverge so completely? One eaten in crisis, the other almost never. Now something even stranger happens. Push the question outside Africa entirely, and the pattern holds. In nearly every culture with historical access to rhinos, from Indian subcontinent traditions to Southeast Asian folklore, Rhino meat is almost absent from culinary history, while rhino horn appears again and again in myth, medicine, and status display. A 16th century Mughal court physician's writings, later cited by historians of South Asian medicine, describe rhino horn cups believed to detect poison in a drink, not rhino stew served at a banquet. Across cultures with no contact with one another, separated by oceans and centuries, the horn became meaning. The meat became nothing. In China, the earliest known pharmacological reference to rhino horn appears in the Shenong Bencao Jing, a medical text compiled roughly 2,000 years ago. It describes the horn as a treatment for fever and delirium, never once as food. 2,000 years of written history across an entire civilization, and the animal's flesh doesn't even earn a footnote. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And patterns like that usually point to something deeper than taste. Now widen the lens even further because the twist gets more uncomfortable. Modern demand for rhino horn isn't rooted in ancient superstition alone. It's been actively rebranded for a new generation. Investigations by the Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network Traffic, published throughout the 2000s and 10s, documented a shift in Vietnam. Rhino horn powder marketed not as traditional medicine, but as a party drug, mixed into wine and consumed by wealthy young professionals to cure hangovers and signal status at business dinners. The symbol didn't fade with modernity, it mutated to fit it. Except there's a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Maybe it really is just about taste. Big game hunters in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when rhino hunting was legal and common, left behind detailed journals. Several described rhino meat as tough, gamey, and unpleasant compared to antelope or buffalo. Dense muscle built for an animal that can weigh 2 tons and still charge at 45 kilometers per hour. Maybe nobody built a taboo. Maybe everybody just didn't like it. But if that were the whole answer, why would the horn become priceless while the meat became worthless, instead of both simply being ignored? A genuinely unpalatable animal gets left alone entirely. It doesn't get hunted to the edge of extinction for one keratin structure, while ecologists watch entire populations collapse. Something else is happening. Something about what the horn represents that the meat never could. This is where the philosophical question gets bigger. Psychologists who study symbolic value, including foundational work by anthropologist Mary Douglas in her 1966 study, Purity and Danger, describe how societies assign meaning to objects not based on their physical properties, but based on what they represent about power, purity, danger, or status. An object becomes valuable not because of what it is, but because of what possessing it says about you. Rhino horn, ground into powder or carved into a dagger handle, as it still is for ceremonial Yemeni jambias, was never really about the keratin. It was about rarity, about danger tamed, about possessing something almost impossible to obtain from an animal willing to kill you for it. You cannot buy that meaning by eating a steak, and that reveals something uncomfortable about human behavior in general. We have, throughout history, been willing to destroy the very thing we claim to value, not despite its rarity, but because of it. The scarcer something becomes, the more some of us seem to want to possess a piece of it, even as that wanting accelerates the scarcity itself. Conservation biologists have a grim term for this feedback loop, the anthropogenic Allee effect, first formally described in a 2006 paper by researchers Frank Korschamp, Elena Angulo, and colleagues. Normally, as a species becomes rarer, hunting it becomes less worthwhile. Fewer animals, more effort, less reward. But for status-driven trophies like rhino horn, the opposite happens. As the species nears extinction, the value of possessing a piece of it rises. Rarity doesn't discourage the hunt. Rarity fuels it, which means the object doesn't need to be useful at all. It only needs to be almost gone. There's a case study that makes this almost unbearably literal. Since the early 2000s, conservation teams across South Africa and Namibia have experimented with dehorning live rhinos, tranquilizing the animal and sawing off the horn painlessly, the same way you'd trim a fingernail, specifically so poachers have nothing left to take. A 2022 study published in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation, tracking reserves across Zimbabwe, found dehorned rhinos still ended up targeted at unexpectedly high rates. Even a stump, it turns out, holds enough symbolic residue to be worth a bullet. Rangers interviewed for that research described something almost existential in the pattern. Poachers weren't just hunting an object anymore, They were hunting the idea that the object might still be there. The animal had become inseparable from the myth built on top of it, stripped of the very thing that made it a target, and killed anyway, on the chance that it wasn't. So the meat was never really the missing piece. It was the visible tip of something much colder, an economy built entirely on symbolism, where the actual biology of the animal was irrelevant from the very beginning. Which raises the real question underneath all of this. How many of the things we chase, discard, and destroy have nothing to do with their function, and everything to do with what we believe they mean? There are fewer than 27,000 rhinos left across all 5 species combined, according to the most recent IUCN assessments. 3 of the 5 species are classified as critically endangered. One of them, the Javan rhino, has fewer than 80 individuals left on Earth, confined to a single national park in Indonesia, guarded around the clock by rangers who know every animal by name. Most of them will never be eaten by anyone. Most of them, if they die at human hands, will be reduced to a single structure made of the same protein sitting under your own fingertips right now. Somewhere in Kruger National Park tonight, a mother rhino is standing beside her calf in the dark, unaware that the very thing making her a target has no power at all, except the power we agreed centuries ago and continents apart to give it. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with after the video ends. Not what makes an object valuable, but how much of that value was never really there to begin with, just borrowed collectively from our own imagination, and never returned.